just like I've never streamed. I like I'm now streaming time, almost never. But anyway, hi Morgan.
We good?
Yeah, we're good. We're live.
All right.
Hi Morgan. Welcome to Adventure with Grace.
Thank you for having me.
Wait, thank you for doing this in your last few days before the big day. Oh, okay. So let's start with like your background. So again, like you're from Singapore, or did you just go to school in Singapore?
I'm not from Singapore. I grew up in North Carolina. Went to UNC Chapel Hill actually, but I studied abroad twice. And the second time I studied abroad at National University of Singapore, NUS. And yeah, it was a great experience. I actually met my husband there. So yeah, exactly. Love in Singapore.
Love in Singapore. Well, okay. So what are some like earlier career experience that you feel like kind of like bring you to who you're today?
Yeah. Well, growing up in North Carolina, like I didn't have too much exposure to like finance and like I would even say tech, like broadly. My parents are sort of in the education space and in the legal space. And so kind of grew up thinking I would want to be a lawyer. And then like my first exposure to kind of, I guess you could say, finance was when people came on campus through UNC and started talking about investment banking, and I was like, wow, this sounds like a magical job. Like it sounded that way to like someone in undergrad. And so I spent a summer interning at Morgan Stanley and just kind of fell in love with sort of like New York City and all the opportunities and kind of the exposure basically that you get to sort of like the top companies in the world. And then so actually ended up staying with the company over 5 years, did a lot of different stuff, but got to work across M&A, IPO, sort of like capital markets focused divisions, as well as like traditional coverage investment banking. And I got to work on some like really, I would say like incredible transactions, from multi-billion-dollar M&A deals in the software space to actually working on the, first WeWork IPO. So like exposure to sort of like venture-backed companies, as well as exposure to companies that were more like bootstrapped, but had like, grown to sort of like, IPO scale. So seeing like that, both sides of those coins, like sort of like founder-led all the way up through to, big sort of, multi-billion-dollar exit potential, as well as kind of like the, WeWork full venture-backed story. Was just like great exposure to kind of, all different types of ways that people build companies.
Wow. Okay, so I have a question for you. So like you mentioned like about the bootstrap company and then now like the IPO company. What do you think, or like the venture-backed company, like what do you think are like the core differences? And since like I feel like a lot of people talk about seed strapping, like, what's your thought on that in the AI?
I mean, the biggest difference was one of them was really profitable and one of them wasn't. That's definitely like the biggest difference. I would say the other big difference is like, I don't think that maybe that's like the best example on the WeWork side, but I think that like some of these outlier sort of like businesses that, still scale to sort of like IPO scale, but without like a lot of external investment. I mean, the founders had incredible ownership of the business. That's one plus to bootstrapping, right? And the other thing is it was a little bit less optimized, I would say, because you don't have as much external feedback. So like they didn't have a private equity background at the cap table. They didn't have VCs. Not that VCs are like, going to help make your business perfect, but it was something where we were like, oh, like, have you thought about trying this? Have you thought about trying this? And ultimately it's like, oh no, we're just, optimizing for like a good business and a profitable business. And I think like, sometimes having some people who kind of see a lot more of what happens externally to like push you in sort of more creative directions could like improve aspects of the business. But that being said, like they were well run, they were profitable, and some of the more venture scale ones were going and were less profitable, right? And obviously that had impacts as well in the capital markets. But I think, I think that what was cool about that experience is we actually did kind of play the role of like, okay, before we go through like an M&A process, like we'll come in and actually help you optimize the business. Which is actually what I ended up doing next in my career, which is I took a little break. I worked on a presidential campaign for Mike Bloomberg, actually. And then I started my own consultancy where I was sort of like helping startups with kind of like some of that optimization of kind of, sort of like best in class, like trying to hit sort of best in class metrics. And then also did some consulting for sort of a lot of, government and philanthropy work and stuff like that. So thought about taking that business further actually and kind of going deeper into like the pre-transaction kind of like let's evolve your business to be best in class from a metrics perspective, but ultimately decided ultimately just discovered venture and thought it was just a great way to spend my time.
Wow. I feel like you're like the girl boss Girl true. I'm sorry.
Thank
Like,
you. I don't know.
I went,
Trying my best.
yeah, love. Okay, so how do you decide on like which like I know that like I'm starting to focus on like the health of
Yeah.
like the financial health, the health, and then there's like, you know, I know that you guys focus on the four category of things.
Yeah.
So I wonder how did you pick your sub-segment on
Yeah.
like AI and healthcare?
Yeah, so I joined the fund 4 years ago. At the time, I, based on my background from Morgan Stanley, covering, I guess you could say like broadly, like the future of work category, which is one of the big ones for us, which kind of, I now sort of categorize like work automation. So sort of automating any sort of like workflow that's sort of archaic and that can be a horizontal workflow. It can also be vertical. So it's quite broad. But I really started spending time there. And so my first investments were like actually in like tax automation and stuff like that. So kind of started getting into like, I guess you could call it like the boring spaces, but where there was opportunity to automate. Turns out like pretty early in, you had GPT-2 come out. And so it was coincidentally like really good timing to start automating away boring work. And I was kind of already spending time in those spaces. So I would say from my background at Morgan Stanley, where I was doing a lot of software, I ended up doing a lot of payroll, sort of like workplace software. I kind of just like leaned into a little bit of what I had already known. Then coincidentally, I at the same time started expanding into sort of like healthcare, but very much so focused on like software and automation. That was actually through like personal experience. My husband actually has a company in the healthcare space. And so just started spending a lot of time like personally talking about healthcare, thinking about healthcare, spending time in the ecosystem. And so the intersection of automation and healthcare is another one where I spent a lot of my time. And then, you start to make several investments and then it kind of snowballs into sort of like spending all your time, in those sectors, right? So I basically spend my time across what I would say like work automation, and then sort of there's an emphasis on kind of like how that translates into the healthcare markets as well.
Totally. Why don't we talk about work automation first, and then we'll talk about healthcare. By the way, shout out to LinkedIn user. Today we have connectivity issues, but you still came up. Your comment still came up. Okay, so I wonder, so how do you think about, I guess like for workspace automation, like how do you subcategorize this category?
Yeah. So I would say there's a few major themes that like we think about. There's like, sector and industry transformation, which I can talk a little bit about sort of where we've been excited and where we've invested there. And then there's like, kind of enterprise, like I would say platform automation. And we've made some investments where sort of like there's a wedge kind of like workflow or market into like a massive platform opportunity to basically re-archetype how you interact with your workforce. So I would say like an example on sort of like the wedge product into a massive platform opportunity is one of our investments in a company called Maven AGI, starting by automating customer support, but they have a full sort of agentic system under the hood that allows you to really automate any workflow and sort of, realize, agents in the workplace and sort of, enterprise AGI. Another good example is another portfolio company called Neural. And they're focusing on sort of like automating payroll, so and benefits as like sort of like their wedge into basically being able to, have capture sort of all of the data around like your people management, and really do back office automation as it relates to the CFO suite and the HR suite, right? So these are massive horizontal plays, big tech builds around system of record. But if you can find sort of like that low hanging fruit of like, this is right for automation right now, because of so many of the advancements in AI and agents, and such a clear use case, an ROI back to these enterprise customers, I think there's like a massive opportunity in that. So I would segment it into like sort of like big enterprise, sort of like platform play. That's one area I spend a lot of time. And then I try to spend some of my time in like very sleepy markets, very kind of like vertical specific, where you're transforming, a system of record kind of like experience for an industry that hasn't really adopted technology in the past. So some examples of that I would say are our government, actually sort of like this is an unannounced investment, but something in sort of like the staffing market. So temporary staffing, manufacturing, stuff like that. We've spent a lot of time looking at like the home health market specifically. So like post-acute care, working with the elderly and stuff like that, agency models, there's a lot of services there. But I think some of the best examples, like I would take government as one example. I think there's like a really exciting, like why now to buy, because most of these sort of sectors have not seen a lot of advancements from traditional software. But now the ROI equation has changed so drastically because you can really reduce headcount, and you can even, before you even reduce headcount, you can like grow top line like crazy. just because it hasn't been a space where it's easy to recruit for. These are, unsexy sort of sleepy markets, we call them. So in government, we have investment in a company called Polymorphic. They focus on local government automation. So everything from like ticketing and permitting and sort of all the stuff you would, call your city government for. They help automate those processes. And then we also have an investment in a company called Prepared 911 that automates call center automation for emergency responses. So 911 and 311 call center automation.
I think Carl mentioned it in his episode.
Probably, yeah. Carl and I work closely with them, yeah.
Love. Okay, so I have a question for you. So like when you're thinking about like selling to the government, I feel like that's like probably the hardest industry to sell to.
Yeah.
And how do you like staff categorize on something that can be automated versus like not?
Yeah, and this goes back to honestly some of the stuff I was talking about at the enterprise scale, like the platform approach. So like usually I think what works best, and this is where like we can have a whole interesting conversation about like system of record versus like point solution. But I think identifying like where there's pull on a very specific problem, getting in the door and like learning from your customer to build out more and more that looks like a platform is sort of what we've seen like as a really good repeatable playbook in government, right? Because they're not going to rip out a bunch of systems on day one. If you have something unique to offer, and for instance, like the initial wedge product that Prepared had, they actually started giving it away for free. And that's actually, how they got a lot of adoption. In doing that, they then realized like, okay, there's a lot of other needs here and like we're well placed to build it. Then you can kind of start building for your customer. So that's like one thing in terms of like just getting in the door with something compelling and then expanding your product, right? I think the other thing that's interesting just in terms of sort of like local network effects is being geographically sort of like concentrated when it comes to government, because government officials kind of talk, they hear, oh, one person's doing this, oh, they see like press about something. And and government, at least in these cases, is like very local. We also have, companies that sell into the federal government. I don't work as closely with those, but like on the local level, there's a lot of sort of, local lobbyists, local conferences. And so word of mouth actually really works, I think in this category. So those are some of the go-to-market sort of like learnings that we've had in the space, which is, you go in with something super like defined, like it's a hard sell, right? You go in with, maybe something that people are intrigued by, and then you learn and you build alongside that. I think that's a better sort of like go-to-market product play. Then similarly, sort of with these like local network effects, it really works well.
Wow. Okay. So this is something like I'm literally not aware of. But anyway, so I wonder, how do you think about the, I guess like doing diligence for like these type of companies? Do you have to have like government connection from your
Well, it's super
Bloomberg
funny.
era?
Yeah. I mean, I do have a little of that. Yeah, but it's actually super funny. Both of these companies we invested in like very, very early on. And at that stage, it's really all about the team. And so I would say, when we invested in Prepared, they weren't actually even doing this. So it's hard to say on that one in terms of the connectivity. But I do think having these playbooks and lessons from working so closely with these companies like does help us advise the next set of companies going after selling into government. So I would say like, yeah, some of those lessons are very useful in doing the diligence. But most of these have been close to pre-product or early product investments. And I think the lesson is like the product's probably going to change. It is slow to build revenue at the start. I'll say that too. And so being patient is actually also like totally normal in government sales. But
what's a growth trajectory look like for selling to the government?
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on some of the models I was talking about where you're kind of coming in with a wedge product that's potentially a free product, and then you're looking at other signals that aren't revenue, right? So there is other signals of growth, just like usage primarily, right? So we spent a lot of time tracking that amongst kind of like adoption of some of these like, freemium or lower priced products. And then how that, when you see that sort of like rapid adoption curve on that, you're onto something. And then there's a good opportunity to charge for software from there. And then that's really the point at which you start to expand sort of like that product, like more horizontally, like I talked about. So I think it goes, like pre-revenue sort of like traction by like a usage basis, turn on some revenue, but maybe it's for like a wedge product that isn't like, super high ACVs. And then from there, it really jumps. So it is kind of like that's what we've seen in our experience is,
that's so interesting.
Slow to build and then very fast from there.
Wow. Okay. So I wonder, so like when
because you also have to earn trust. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
that's big in government. So
for sure. I wonder, so like for the in terms of like, I think we briefly talk about ads. I feel like that's such a interesting category because nowadays like people just like probably use like Anthropic or like Perplexity or OpenAI like a lot more than like Google for some people. How do you think like where is the ads industry going, and is there like any really interesting like monetization model besides advertising, like you know the in the customer space or in like just like any space that people are making, and then is there any like interesting company that coming out of the ad space?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time researching this theme. Just kind of thinking about our initial thesis around AI. We've got sort of like these like transforming sleepy markets. We've got the idea of sort of like a wedge solution into a broader platform solution. And then we have some really interesting thoughts we can circle back to around sort of like personalization and sort of like how you use unstructured data to power, hyper personalization with LLMs. But this sort of, we've kind of invested a lot behind those three major themes within AI. And now we're thinking about like what's next. And so we think a lot about like sort of second order effects. So now that LLMs are changing consumer behavior, we were just chatting earlier and I was like going to ChatGPT to use it for a search query, right? So you are seeing traffic diverted away from the traditional search methods, like Blue Links and Google, right? And so I think that we've been thinking about for quite some time. So what are the second order effects of that? You no longer have so much concentration in these kind of like walled gardens of advertising that kind of own all of the traffic. You're starting to see that break up a little bit. Granted, you're still seeing like concentration with like GPT and OpenAI and Perplexity and others like that. But you are starting to see a long tail develop as well, very specific sort of like search tooling, whether it's for students, whether it's for medical affairs, stuff like this, right? And so then the question becomes, well, how are those companies going to monetize? I think there's been a lot of, recently like recognition that it's probably going to be through advertising. So how is that who's going to kind of capture the value there, right? It's probably not going to be like a Google, so or Facebook, maybe in their own ecosystems for sure. But who is there room for a third party infrastructure player to act as like a new style of DSP? Essentially, is one theme that we've been exploring. Another theme we've been exploring is like, okay, now people are sort of making purchase decisions, and there's sort of like the new shopping features in ChatGPT already working with Shopify. So it's like, okay, can you now that you can make purchases, like how do you as a brand control how you show up? What consumers see, right? And then I think the third layer to this that we've been exploring is hyper personalization, which is like how much can an LLM contextualize about me, how much memory and understanding they have of my preferences, such that over time they're honestly shopping on my behalf, right? Like, and I don't actually need to read and click on anything and make a decision, or I get sort of, prompted with like a very concrete decision, right? And maybe it's an ad in an ad format, right? But that ad format probably looks different than what we think of as an ad today, right? So I think the early ad formats we're seeing are sort of like, hey, this is an ad, like, very subtle, right? Or sort of like very like clear kind of like textual ad. But if you think in the future, especially as we think about like different modalities, like if you're watching a generative sort of like movie and something in that movie is like purchasable, right? So you're watching like a YouTube video on like skiing and there's like a ski hat and it's like, can you just like purchase the ski hat, right? Can it like recommend it to you? Like, hey, I see you've looked at 4 movies, and by the way, I know you're going skiing because I booked your travel for you last week. Like, do you want to buy this? Like, so something like that, like you can see over time, the more and more memory and the more and more context you have on a person. And that's where you get into some really interesting conversations about like capturing memory and context across platforms, right? Like, how do I have my own identity of like sort of the things that I care about across multiple LLMs? So we actually have a company that's kind of building in and around this space. It's a company called Kudos, but they have a product called Shelf. Basically like the storage for like all of your preferences on the web.
Wow. Oh my God.
That's a cool one. Yeah, I'm not exposed to it, but you should chat with Mark about it. It's a very interesting one. But there's a whole sort of, I think, again, second order effect, I think, as it relates to sort of memory, context sharing, infrastructure around that, I think is gonna be very interesting as well.
Wow. Okay. So I wonder, what do you think, like in the future of like ads?
Yeah.
What does that look like, and then who is gonna actually benefit from it? Is that like the OpenAI of the world, or who is actually, and then currently, is it ranked by Google or like, so like, how is the answer actually generated? Like, I'm just like so curious on like, if I use my ChatGPT, if I like type in the same question, like, or just like talking about like web assembly, like if I just like type it into my ChatGPT, will it show up with the same answer that show up in yours? Or like, is this like,
if you're doing like a fresh like query, like probably, but you know, you have these different, you know, longer form memory chains, and then they do remember stuff about like what you had previously asked about, right? So it kind of depends on the flow of like the conversation, right? As to what you're gonna get sort of as a response. But I would say, like, to your question of like where we think the value is going to accrue, I would say OpenAI will benefit, Perplexity will benefit. I'm not sure that they're going to open up. I'm not sure if they're going to like allow anyone to place ads, you know, other than them sort of like within their ecosystem. I don't know. They might pick a partner to do that. The benefit of picking a partner is that like brands might want to advertise like across multiple different sort of systems. They're probably going to want to have unified messages. But there's also a chance that like the biggest players like an OpenAI will just go direct, you know, like a Google does or like a Facebook does, right?
For sure. I actually feel like that's coming because like lately I've been following the news. This is not like any information that's not in public, but I saw like Fiji from like Instacart. So she built out like the Instacart ads platform, and then she's at OpenAI. So I would assume she.
It's definitely going to come. I think
tomorrow we'll see ads.
No, I'm not going to be. And I think Perplexity already said that they were going to explore it. So I think
Perplexity does a lot of like shopping related things. I think that's a good direction. But on the other hand, like since like right now, like OpenAI or like cloud, everybody can like just like research online. Do you still think like there's like room for Perplexity to go into to like dominate the market?
I mean, I think that Perplexity is gonna. I use both, so I don't know. I think OpenAI has a lot more like traffic and brand recognition, you know, sort of like the broader consumer mind share. But so I don't know if Perplexity is going to go out and dominate, but I think that they have like you know, you've seen in other categories, you know, multiple winners, you know, with consumer love, like the coding space, for example, like Windsurf and Cursor, like, you know, you just like think if you build a good product and people are using it, like you have a good shot. Will you know, are you going to beat OpenAI at this point? Probably not. But there's still a really big market out there, right? But to your like earlier question about just kind of like where the value accrues, so I think like, you know, you could say like maybe it stays with OpenAI's and Perplexities of the world. And then I think there's another question, which is like, okay, with this new ad format and like potentially all these different types of styles of like new ad units, which we don't know exactly what they're going to look like, but especially in the multimodal world, you know, they could get very creative, right? Is there a long tail of sort of like formats and sort of like placement of these ads, like kind of within even like you know, like long tail sort of like generative, you know, entertainment or generative search engines, or even within like traditional consumer facing sort of like applications, like a game, for example, right? So like where can this kind of be applied in sort of like interactive environments in terms of sort of like that generative style of advertising? And I think there you actually have like probably a potentially greater shot at kind of penetrating into those markets versus like trying to be the infrastructure for OpenAI, who is probably going to have their own infrastructure for ads, basically. My hypothesis. I'm not sure exactly, right? So that's one way where you could make the case that there's like value to be captured. I think the other one is like on the actual, you know, company side, like helping them understand and sort of like navigate and actually, you know, impact sort of like how they are perceived within this new sort of like, you know, search function, right? There's a lot of money spent like in, you know, categories like SEO and all that kind of stuff. There's a big transformation of what SEO is going to mean and sort of like how you appear within LLMs. So is there sort of like productization that can be built around that? Is there infrastructure that can be built around that? I mean, we spent a lot of time talking to agencies on this front. They're obviously all thinking about this as well, thinking about partnering just around sort of like analytics and insight. So there's a whole category of companies that have come out kind of doing like the measurement tooling and sort of like the impact tooling for these brands. I think the question, you know, for those companies is kind of like, yeah, can you basically build a new style of like generative first kind of like agency, and can that scale to sort of like a venture style business versus kind of being sort of more fragmented. There's a lot of companies in SEO. They're like good businesses, right? But there's not so many sort of venture scale businesses, right? So that's the question.
How do you evaluate the agentic SEO platforms?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like anything. We kind of categorize whether it's sort of like, are you going after enterprise? Are you going after the brand side? Or going after the long tail? Are you focused more on consumer? Are you focused more on sort of like generative search? Are you focused on more on building like an agency model? Or are you focused on sort of building pure infrastructure technology? Are you building more of a marketplace for sort of like advertisers and publishers? Like there's like all sorts of different ways you can like segment the market. So we spend a lot of time thinking about segmentation and who's most similar within all those segmentation categories. And then like the reality is, I think there's multiple ways to potentially build a big business. And so it's not that, they may all converge, they may end up going in different directions. So it's not necessarily clear that like one strategy is going to be the absolute best strategy, right? I think it then comes down to team and execution, which is really how we evaluate most of the opportunities at the stage in which we invest. So, I think it's like building a thesis around here's 3 or 4 sort of strategies that we find to be compelling. And then it's like, can you back the team that's going to be able to actually, do the best first opening chess move. So like really kind of capture whether it's mind share, whether it's early traction, whether it's the right partners. And then are they the team that's going to continue to be able to navigate that? We talk a lot about this metaphor of being like a speedboat versus like a sailboat. So like, are you going to just like, exactly what you're doing and you're racing to sort of like the finish? Or is it more of a sailboat where you're going to have to navigate? And I think this is a space where it's going to be a lot of navigation, right? So it's like, can you come out strong with some type of an advantage? And then from there, like, are you going to be able to like navigate with the changing sort of like seas? Because like, we don't know what OpenAI is going to do. We don't know, you don't know what, sort of regulations going to come. We don't know sort of like the next, like, we can predict some interesting consumer behavior and consumer trends, but we don't know for sure. Right.
For sure. I wonder, so like, how do you think about spending your time within a category? So for example, in the ad category, there is like you mentioned, like there's like so many like newer agency style things. There's like also ad measurement. There's like 500 other things going on in one space. How do you quickly like identify one company that can like go far? Obviously like the team, but like I said, what does a diligence process kind of look like for you? Yeah.
The other caveat to all that is like most of these companies are still like idea stage to early traction. So like when you think about diligence, like it's a lot of like getting to know the team, spending time with the team, talking about their hypothesis. We also do on our end a lot of diligence through like our connectivity in our network. So making a lot of introductions to people who are either potential users of the product, potential sort of advertisers, people who have been in space for a long period of time, and really get the experts' feedback, right, or potential customer feedback. Again, when it's so early, it's also like sometimes that can be a false signal as well, right? And that's why I go back to like super early, like 90% of the decision falls on kind of like the team. And so the diligence process is like, let's sit down and let's like talk about what you're building, right? And let's throw a bunch of like sort of like hypothetical questions at you and see how you think, really. Like that's a lot of it. Let's look at your background, like do you have relevant background? Do you have relevant network connectivity? And then also putting you in front of our network and getting feedback from our network that, is like hyper relevant is like probably the second big piece. We do a lot of diligence, in terms of speaking with like, if you are live with customers and stuff like that, obviously that's like customer love and like, but again, this early, like it's not always going to be completely figured out. And so you have to be a little cautious about that as possible.
As I remember, I feel like you guys are one of the funds who are like more constant in like with a concentrated approach versus like very like diversified. And how do you think about like, I guess like when you're doing diligence, like how long does it take? And then do you have like a method that's like you're using all the time? Because I think it's like harder to like measure the measurement. I don't know.
We really bifurcate between like 2 types of diligence. And I would say we're actually a function that does a lot more diligence, like on average. It's actually what we've been told from like founders, right? Like you guys did like some of the most work of anybody else, right? And so sometimes that's like not great because like also speed is important. And so I would say like it really depends on the type of like the size of the check we're writing. You know, I think we can be a little bit more like instinctive when it's a smaller, earlier check and you're really backing a person. And that can be sort of, you know, several sort of like in-depth meetings and like interactions. And then I think that like when it comes to writing a larger check, that's where we really do dig in and do a lot of work. But we try to add value back in that process, like so that it's not just like a one-way street of like taking up somebody's time, but we're trying to send you customers. We're trying to send you partners. We're trying to send you advisors. And so that's kind of how we end up doing sort of like that additional layer of work. And yeah, I think we're pretty thorough when we're writing a big check. In terms of like the time trade-off and just like how to identify like the areas and like where you like double down on spending time, I think for me, I try to spend time as early as possible with the people who are just kind of bubbling up new ideas and thinking about stuff. And so I do a lot of like stuff in the community in New York and sort of in the AI community in general, and then and also on the West Coast too. And then, you know, kind of like think about sort of, okay, what are the earliest signals of like trends? And what really stands out is like very differentiated, because, you know, your whole job is to talk to companies. And sometimes there's like 10 companies doing the same thing. It's very hard. But when you're early enough in identifying something that is like truly differentiated, like a new kind of like trend, I think you can be a lot more thoughtful and you can kind of have you know, a nuanced like point of view that'll help you go after sort of like the next like 3 to 4 to 5 companies that come out of that market. So I would say like with this marketing, advertising sort of next generation of kind of sort of like branding within LLMs, like we were very early to the trend, and that really helped us develop a point of view, helped us get in front of sort of like all of the major players like quite early. And that, you know, at some point, if you're late to a trend, like the access becomes like pretty impossible, right? So I think that is like very, very key. So it's a little bit of like, I think our job is to like spend time with really smart people, pick up on what's unique, and then like go hard in terms of like digging around in those categories to educate yourself, learn as much as you can, try to add value back to people who are thinking about that, and then get the right to sort of like potentially invest in a company.
I wonder when it comes to like the trends, or maybe we can start like, I want to like go into like healthcare a little bit. So I actually feel like there's a lot of like New York VCs that are like focusing on healthcare. But how do you think about like what are investable, what are not? Just, I think I've heard about like people investing in, you know, the Facebook for lawyer type of things. And then nowadays it's, Facebook for doctor type of thing. Sorry, we're talking about healthcare. My brain just died. But anyway, so yeah, we're so there's like basically the non-healthcare part of the healthcare, and then there is also like the scribe market. That's like a really big market. I feel like I've seen a lot of like Bay Area investor and invested in a bridge. So like, what are some, I guess, like interesting trends that you're seeing in the space, and then how do you categorize healthcare as a whole in the space?
Yeah, I think healthcare is really interesting because, you know, you've got a compliance and sort of just like a higher level of governance and sort of like oversight that really has to occur. So, you know, some of these scribe companies like build traction like very, very quickly. You know, but you have this whole sort of like ecosystem under the hood of kind of like the, you know, lifeblood of healthcare running through the EMR systems, which are like, you know, much more legacy. And so it really comes down to like, can you build the right partnerships? But more than that, I think if you take like a long-term view on some of this stuff, I think that it's my opinion, actually I've seen this play out with a lot of my portfolio companies, that like, it's actually best to like really own like you know, there's 2 schools of thoughts. Like you can kind of like build on top of these legacy systems of records, or you can kind of like build an end-to-end, you know, sort of solution that's like purpose-built for like agents working across a system, which means you have to be the system of record. So we actually have an investment in a company called Canvas Medical, and they are an EMR. They have like developer tooling, and they have an SDK where you can build directly on top of it. But you know, they're able to do things that other sort of like scribes are not able to do, while still doing the like fundamental scribing technology, right? So I think there's a world in which you can become like a pretty interesting company by being first with a potentially sort of you know, singular solution, like a point solution. You still have to be really, really good at like the accuracy. Like there's still a really high bar within healthcare, right? So I've seen some really interesting companies around like scheduling, around scribing, but the technology, like, you know, like at least in the interim is still a big differentiator. as is sort of like the like compliance and accuracy aspect of it. Of course, distribution is also like huge in healthcare, right? So like all the classic things like could help you scale in that way. But I think like long term, actually having sort of like a moat around being the system of record, I think not only helps you expand beyond that point solution, because as an example, Canvas, not only can sort of, help you take notes through their own scribe, they can directly take the context from those notes and schedule follow-up appointments. They can send prescriptions with that information because they own sort of like the entire sort of like underlying system of record, right? And so I think that trend is harder to build. It's very hard to build. And building EMR is very, very difficult. But you see people potentially going after that by starting with that wedge product. I think it's pretty hard, but not impossible, right? So, you can either expand a little bit more horizontally and kind of own more and more sort of like the infrastructure on top of the EMR and sort of reduce the EMR to more of a database. But then you lose, I think, a little bit of that end-to-end ability to sort of have agents like fully act as admin, officials within the healthcare system, which I think is like the really exciting opportunity. I think the same applies for like other categories. So we made an investment in a company called Radiant Graph that's really focused on like personalization within healthcare and patient engagement. They're very focused on like the payer market, but in order to do that, they really have to build an ML system that is like able to segment different patient populations, that's able to ingest claims data, understand where patients are in their care journey and meet them where they are. That's like table stakes in terms of building that infrastructure, which is actually really hard to do in healthcare. In order to then optimize on a bigger opportunity, which is okay, then how do you sort of like automate those patient engagement sort of mechanisms, whether it's like automated marketing systems, whether it's automated phone systems, whether it's chat and text systems, right? So next time you want to sort of like access a benefit with your plan, like it could very well be like fully automated experience, not having to like sit on hold and talk to someone, or someone reaching out to you proactively because they know where you are in your care journey, right? But those are very complicated to build, right? So we've taken the approach that like the complicated ones will be the ones that are going to have the moat long term and are going to be able to capture the most value. But I do think like the exception to that is like if you're able to find a niche area of healthcare that just has so much demand. And I would kind of put home health in this category, right? Where like we talked about with city markets, but like the productivity gains are just so big that they can't be ignored. People want it now. You don't have time to build like all of this, right? This is very complicated. So is there a wedge product that you can like enter with? We can show that quick ROI and then earn the right to like build deeper and deeper into the stack. The only problem with that is you got to be first. You got to build the brand first, and you have to go fast at the problem because there'll be a lot of fast followers. We've already seen it. I think we spent the last year kind of digging into the home health market, and there's now so many companies coming after the opportunity. So two schools of thought. I think both could like be interesting. We've put more stock in kind of like the long-term play around building like that system of record and that platform, because we know sort of like within healthcare, integrations are like so important into these system of records. And it's a non-trivial thing to do in healthcare.
What is the go-to-market strategy for healthcare? You mentioned about like having a wedge product and then expand, but like at the beginning, like does the person have to have like, I don't know, like a spouse work in the hospital industry, or like what's the whole vibe?
It's actually really interesting. It's a very conference-driven sort of like,
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Well, it depends on the space, right? Like, I mean, I'd say in insurance, I would say in like home health. I think like within sort of like the acute markets, within health systems, that's like a little bit different. Your network within a system is going to be very valuable. But even within specialties, like getting like buy-in. So I have another portfolio company I'm on the board of called Able Health, and they're in the GI like personalization space. So kind of back to sort of our personalization thesis. They personalize GI care, but they work very closely with like the Mayo Clinic and like the Cleveland Clinic, stuff like that. But that was really the founder. He was a patient, but then also spent like years sort of like integrating himself in like the GI community with these researchers, with doctors, with clinicians, payers, like anybody who, even employers, like anybody who's like really interested in the topic. And there are a lot of like, industry specific conferences, right? And so I think like that's one way to sort of like penetrate and build your brand. It's actually what I hear the most from like early stage founders, like, all right, we're going to big conferences and stuff like that. I think that's like day one, like early stage, and then it really comes down to like similar types of distribution, I think. And for depending on the type of product, a true sales motion, enterprise sales motion really depending on the product.
Yeah, I'm like so
Yeah.
fascinated because
Yeah.
I feel like for the hospital, like, is there like, you mentioned like there's a conference. So let's say
Yeah.
I go to the conference, I'm like selling my, I don't know, my scribe. I don't know, like that's the only thing I can think about me selling it. But so let's say I'm selling the scribe and then like I talk to you who, I mean, I guess you work at a hospital or like you're like another startup or like who do I sell it to? Is it like, or like I sell it to the insurance?
The hospital
guy,
system,
or
I would say, is a little bit. So I would say insurance and there are insurance specific conferences. I would say insurance and hospital systems are slightly different. They do attend conferences, like the big ones, like HIMSS and sort of like Health and Vibe. Like they do attend those. But those are very network driven. So another thing that works as well is like advisors and sort of like consultants, if you will. There's a lot of healthcare consultants. So people who can open doors. That is like one popular way to get into those like big systems. Or if you came from a system, have a background, kind of selling into systems before, you're gonna have a Rolodex. So those like higher end of the market things, like insurance, like top like insurance, sort of breaking into insurance carriers and then also breaking into like big health systems, it is a little bit more network driven. But I think that like there's a subset outside of like those big systems, like solo practitioners or like sort of like mental health focus or like GI, like any of those kinds of things where it is very like, kind of industry specific. And there's a lot of conferences around that. I also think that like, that's also, GI doctors, work at big health systems, right? So there's like a way to like pull you into the system through, initial interactions with clinicians. There's like multiple like ways in. I think it's like, you can almost segment it by like enterprise and like SMB, but the difference being that like, it is like, even within enterprise, there's like so many subsegments, right? Because it could be, are you working cardiology? Are you working in neurology? Are you working in GI? If you're a total horizontal solution, that's like a little bit different. And that's where I think the advisor motion is like very helpful. But if you're focused on like a specific vertical, you almost have to kind of get all of the stakeholders involved. Like that's the hard thing about healthcare.
Wow. Oh my God. So who are the stakeholders? Are they the hospital, the insurance? Like I have to come to everyone or like I just come to one guy and then
insurance, the physicians, the clinical users, sometimes like pharma's even involved.
Does like everybody have to take a cut or like it's just like I just convince you like and then I'm good?
It has to work for everyone. Okay. It's not always that someone's making, sometimes there's multiple parties making money, right? But I think that it has to like work for everyone. So, sometimes you'll sell into sort of like a system but they'll kind of want you to have insurance coverage, right? They just won't want their patients being offered something that's like cash pay or stuff like that, right? So then they'll push you towards that, and maybe they'll make the introductions on, right? So
the cycle goes on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would say like the one really big lesson in healthcare is similar to government. It does take a long time. It does. It's not for something that is like a deeply, a deeply sort of like system of record product. I would say you can see more viral adoption from like prosumer motion. So like you actually brought up like this like Facebook for doctors sort of stuff, like we made a small investment in sort of like a more consumer, and we've looked at kind of like this like use case as well, which is like the future of kind of like, for lack of a better term, like an AI doctor or replacing like Google, like for doctors, right? Like where can patients and like consumers go to get their medical advice, much quicker, right? Like that's totally different. That's like consumer exposure. Oftentimes they are sort of like incorporating physicians because, it needs to be also, very above board and sort of follow the standard protocols, right? But
I have a question for you. I just think of it. Okay, so like in the doctor space, there's like on our show, there were like guests that are investing in like AI does your surgery. That's one spectrum. The other spectrums, there's like we're only gonna do anything make the doctor efficient, like the front desk for the dentist, right? So like there's like two different bets. One is like increasing productivity of the doctor's office, and then the other part is like I'm just gonna literally replace the doctor. And which spectrum like do you feel like you're leaning towards too, and why?
We focus a lot on like automating productivity. I think it's like similar to kind of like where we started the conversation, which is like I think about a lot of sort of like the crazy amount of admin burden across like different specialties, different sort of like areas of the enterprise spectrum, and there's no like more wasted admin spend than there is in like healthcare, right? So it's like a very perfect example of things to automate. That being said, like I think that's where I spend more of my time. I think there's a ton of like ROI to be had there. But I do think, and this is a place I don't spend time, which is like sort of like med device, like drug discovery, robotics. I spend less time there. But there's a lot of interesting stuff on the horizon that, could, fully replace and automate like human labor. I do think that's like, that'll be a question of timing, like when, because there's going to be regulatory, hurdles, like, to be able to get to like that future state. But I wouldn't say it's like impossible that that's going to be like a very interesting opportunity in the future. It's just not one where like I try to stick to sort of like more software kind of like focused stuff, within my sort of like wheelhouse and expertise. But I don't see it as something that will be far out of the realm of possibility.
How do you, I guess, like measure, I guess like since you invest in like very diverse subsectors, like from like, I guess like the customer service to healthcare to like, increasing, I guess like productivity and to like, I guess ads as well. Yeah. So how do you kind of like eliminate things that are like noise for you? Because like, are you one of the people who like literally write a map of like there's 45 company in this space and then we're bullish about X? Or like, how do you just like not look at something just because obviously you can spend your time on like 400 new companies, but like, how do you decide on like which one you want to repetitively go deeper in? Yeah,
I think like there is a trade-off between sort of like, kind of what we talked about, which is like finding interesting trends early versus like getting like pigeonholed and sort of like a lot of depth into something that ultimately may never like materialize into kind of like making an investment, right? So there's a balance in that. For me personally, like I said, because I spend so much time on the early stage, I only just focus on the people, like first and foremost, right? So I'm actually more driven by that. And then secondarily, sort of like by the idea. And so then like, after you've gone through one screen of like, is this person like incredibly talented, interesting, driven, like all the crazy things you need to be like a founder, building for venture, like truly it's a very unique, personality and type of person. And then like, does this ideal like lend itself well to venture as well? Once you go through like 2 iterations of that, you kind of have like a smaller bucket of, okay, and here's 3 categories that have kind of evolved from those 2 stages. Which one do I want to go deep in because I'm most interested in, right? Maybe you can do a few at a time, with leverage, and honestly, like all the like sort of AI tooling is like incredibly helpful in that regard too. Like all these like AI research agents that are out there. We have a good team here at M13, so we do a lot of like leveraging those tools. And then also we have a technical team, that supports our portfolio companies, and so we do a lot of testing of tools as well. Which helps us kind of like get to a point of view. Over time, maybe a lot of that will be like automated, right? Like go try this product for me and give me product feedback, right? Like, you're already seeing kind of like, customer interviews being like automated away. So like over time, like maybe a lot of the research and like, digging work that we do will be like semi-automated, right? You're still kind of early on the frontier. So hard to get those signals. But that's kind of my screening methodology. It all starts with kind of like the person and how sort of like special they are. And then, well, what are they working on? Do I think that's an equally interesting kind of like venture scale opportunity? And then from there, I'm actually going to like dig in to a few categories. And I would say like, while things seem to be somewhat different across like all the things that we talked about, there's a lot of like overlap and similarities I think that you can pull from like your experiences. So for instance, like between customer support, payroll, and sort of like, CFO's suite, and then like compliance automation, a company called Normia here in New York that we invest in the seed. All of those have like, they're very different categories. You have to get up to speed on sort of like what are the pain points in each of these categories. But a lot of the approaches and the sort of like, philosophies behind sort of like the systems that they're building are very similar. And so ultimately, a lot of what, it comes down to is kind of like understanding the market opportunity, but really backing the people and then helping them sort of like with what are the most critical things that you need to do in order to scale this business, right? And a lot of those lessons are very transferable. They are, yeah. So it's not as, at the early stage, I think it's not as crazy as let me meet every single company and lay out like 100 logos and select one. That at the growth stage, you should definitely do, right? Because it's very clear There's a lot more clarity on sort of like metrics that you can do. Because the other thing is like, think about it from a timing perspective. If you were to do that, you probably would have missed the round that you would have wanted to invest in for a lot of these, just given like the early nature of it, right? So you do want to be prepared, you want to be thoughtful, but like there's also like you could be too thoughtful and then you'll never do anything because you'll be like, oh, I'll just keep waiting and building my like market map, and then all the rounds will have been like, now they're 500 million valuation, which is like, out of our range, right? So there is like a balance between like bias to action, and getting as much context as you can as well.
Wow, bias to action, love the Amazon term. But okay, so I think like another thing is maybe I want to focus on like the frontier vibe things.
Sure.
You want to drink some water?
I'm actually thirsty. Yeah.
You're a very fast talker. I love it because your brain's like working. So how do you think about, I guess, like the frontier? I think we briefly chat about like I guess
sort of what's next.
Yeah, what's next? Like obviously like the non-sexy space is very hot right now. And
now it's hot,
now it's like everyone's like doing something industrial.
They are, yeah.
Construction.
Yeah.
The data industries, when you look at like the factories, like automation of the factories and all that kind of stuff. So how do you filter out something that like you would do better than everybody else?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think for us, if you're digging around in a hot space, you're like already a little bit late to the party, right? So, I mean, I think some of the categories that we've thought about that we think are like adjacent to maybe some of these trends, and like I said, kind of fit into that order of like maybe it's a second order effect, but also potentially even just like a little early to a trend. AI in sort of like the physical world is like becoming like more and more like sexy and like hot and stuff like that. But I would still say that there's pockets of it that maybe are a little bit less sexy, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in like the energy markets and sort of like weather prediction and stuff like that. And people are starting to like explore these areas. But I would say like one that I kind of like think a lot about is sort of like kind of like understanding from like satellite data, as it relates to building infrastructure and stuff like that. Kind of, what can you predict from a data perspective that can actually inform like insurance underwriting, because that's a massive market, and there's a lot of sort of like opportunity to purchase data around that, to build ML models, and to capture like net new data in the physical world, by providing maybe productivity tooling to some of these like workers in the field, to allow them to capture more and more net new data, right? That can better inform sort of like insurance underwriting models, and insurance companies would be willing to pay for something like this, right? So that's a few orders of magnitude like delayed from like, okay, I'm going to use like AI to like help construct a construction project, right? Which is also an interesting use case in the physical world, right? So I think it's kind of like semi-removed kind of like ripple effects from some of this is something that we think a lot about. We think a lot about that sort of on the infrastructure side as well. Like I know we were sort of like talking about like maybe what's next as it relates to, kind of in a world where humans are doing less navigation of the web, like how do agents sort of like perceive context on companies, on sort of like websites? How are they able to like make purchases, safely on the behalf of humans? So there's a lot of kind of like that downstream stuff that I think people are starting to think about, but there's still a lot more to come and a lot to be discovered. So I think those are kind of some of the areas that we think about as like on the frontier of like what's next. Now the issue there is like the timing, right? So are you too early on that, whatnot? But I think things are moving so fast, and that I think like if you find the right team building in this category, I think there's some interesting opportunities right now.
So who is the right team? Like I think this is like, where do you find the founders? Just because I feel like living in Silicon Valley, like I can just feel like it's more of like the SpaceX engineer, or like the OpenAI engineer, like something like that. But how do you think about like actually what makes a good team?
Yeah. There's like a few vectors. I think like for first and foremost, like I think team compatibility, like founder breakups happen a lot, right? And that's like actually a big reason companies like don't work, versus like the idea was wrong, or like it wasn't the right technical team or something like this, right? So I think it's like dynamic of the team, like, and in that way, sometimes like solo founders are actually like a little bit less risky, it's like some people don't like solo founders, but it's like they don't have that, you take that risk off the table, right away. Has the team like worked together for a really long time? And then the other big thing is like, do they really have like founder market fit? And that could be because they have the experience, but it could also be because they have the mindset and because they've gone so deep in a problem space. It's very apparent when someone knows a space like incredibly well who hasn't even had exposure to the space. Like that means that they have like an incredible growth mindset and that they've gone like incredibly deep on this problem and have a lot of empathy for like their customers. And that usually shows up in like the way they build product and the way they like sell to their customers and stuff like that, right? So I think like that is like one vector is kind of like stability of the team and then depth of kind of like knowledge about the problem space, whether that's because they've been like living and breathing the problem themselves for like, you know, in the healthcare example, someone has a patient, you know, of a condition, right? Something like that. Or in the example that I was talking about with Radiant Graph, sort of like that founder has worked in ANML and healthcare for like 30 years, right? So he just like deeply understands these systems, right? And understands how to, you know, process very complex claims data. So it's like a very different, they're coming steeped like from the industry, but I think you can still see that in sort of like early stage teams who like put themselves in the position to like younger teams who put themselves in the position to really learn and really grow their mindset around a problem. So I think like those two are really interesting. And then I think there's no like substitute for like, you know, wild ambition and like ability to run and manage a company, which is a different skill set than kind of just like, you know, being a good engineer. Like it's a very different skill set. So that is harder to test for. I think that's like a little bit more like pattern recognition. Clearly, like anyone who's like had a company before has learned a lot from that experience. Maybe it was successful, maybe it was somewhat successful, maybe it was like wildly successful, right? Like they have a track record, like that's a little bit easier to dig into. But if it's like a first time founder, it's a little bit harder to test for. But I think it's kind of like how business minded are these people? How much do they care about like not just building a cool product, but building something that's a very like, you know, sustainable and scaled kind of company. And that is really like how do you test for it? I mean, it's really just kind of like something you spend time with people on sort of like in person. Of course, you can reference them, you can, you know, but you can test ambition with like some interesting questions. I think usually best done in person. But I think that is like kind of like the third thing that we really think about with the team, which is like how much do they want to win? How big do they want to build? How ambitious are they? And do they have the skill set to really achieve any of that from like a leadership and from like a business perspective? Because like I said, building a business is like very, very different than like being a genius and being able to build really cool products. And so again, maybe it's a combination of people, maybe it's, you know, one person and their ability to bring in the genius to build the product, right? So, you know, there's all sorts of different flavors, really. I don't think you can be like overly prescriptive on like, this is the type of team that I invest in, because I think that you can find a lot of different talented flavors of kind of like those, you know, 3 or 4 different buckets. Yeah.
I want to be mindful of the time.
Sure.
Okay, so one real question and one myth around.
Yeah.
One real question is like you mentioned about like there's a set of questions, let's say 3 questions that you ask to everyone.
Sure.
Like what is something that, give us like one question that you would ask every founder to test?
I like this question. I like the question that like, if this doesn't, succeed in the way that you would have wanted it to succeed, like what would have happened?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So like if this, like, you know, you say you want to build like this incredible generational company, like if for some reason you don't, like what would have been the reason?
Wow, that's a good one. Like,
I like that one.
I mean, like honestly,
Yeah.
I hear the founders typically just say like some like facts, like, oh, like, you know, the market crash, or like it will never not work.
And I also use that question with in references too. So that's like also where you can get like interesting insights, which is like, you know, I tend to ask people like, oh, would you invest your own money in this person? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, if you lose all your money, like, why do you think you would have lost it all? Like, what would have happened in the company? So you get like outside perspectives, like as well, like, and then you also can sort of like, you know, say like, oh, well, here's what I heard from, you know, other people who know you well, said maybe this, maybe that. Like, what do you think, right? But yeah, I think it's like really good to like, I think one trait in like people in general, I definitely test for, and like certainly in founders, is like self-awareness, right? If they answer with like, oh, the market just like completely disintegrates out from under me and I would have done nothing wrong, that's not necessarily a positive thing. I mean, there is market risk, right? So you can identify market risk, but usually it leads into like a bigger conversation around, you know, self-awareness about sort of like the limits of like what you're building and your own limits as a person.
Yeah, I feel like I hear about like too extreme a lot. It's like one type of people just like, oh, it would never go wrong. And then the other part is like, oh, anything could go wrong. And then you're like, oh my God, here
anything can go.
literally nothing.
Yeah.
Oh my God, on that note, okay, so let's do the women fan round. What's your favorite book?
Oh, I love Educated. I like I like anything that's like a biography is sort of about like overcoming access to kind of information and knowledge. And this book's by like Tara Westerfeld or something. Have you heard of it? Okay, it's called.
But I'm gonna Google this
right
after.
Yeah.
Whose biography is it?
Her name's Tara. She basically grew up in like outside of sort of like the norms of kind of like society, and basically was like not allowed to go to school, not allowed to interface with like the government or the healthcare system, basically like sort of like a little bit of like an off-grid like family situation. And so it's like about her finding her path to sort of like education and like learning. I think it's a very interesting concept.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay, so who made the biggest impact in your career?
Definitely my parents. Yeah, I just think in my life, like I think your support system like sets you up to like take risks. And so I've been very fortunate, I feel like, to have like, supportive parents that allowed me to like, feel loved and supported and go out and try things even when it wasn't clear like how they would turn out.
Who made the biggest impact? Wait, who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh, who would I invite to a dinner party? There's so many amazing people. It's hard to say. Maybe Abraham Lincoln, if he can come back and go to a dinner party, only because like I think like one thing I also like really have come to respect, is just people with like super high kind of like morals and kind of like willingness to go against the grain. And I just think that it'd be interesting to have dinner with him.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Sorry?
Where can we find you outside of work?
Oh, mostly at work. But I also like to exercise. So I do we actually have a Barry's boot camp like right below this office. So you go to Barry's and go to like Pilates and like try to I was an athlete all through growing up. So like I think like outside of work, like exercise and sports are definitely sort of a great outlet.
Oh, love that. Well, Morgan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a fun conversation. Yeah. You're so knowledgeable. And then you have some great work ethic. Oh my God. Yeah.
What time is it? Yeah, time to go home.
Please go home. Okay, so thank you so much, Morgan.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
And